Hello, and welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to enable session cookies in your ASP.NET MVC application, and we're going to go ahead and deploy it to our Service Fabric cluster. And the purpose of this video is actually to continue our conversation that we started in the last video, where I want to actually show you some of the challenges that you're going to run into when building these kind of applications and hosting them in Service Fabric, specifically because of the way that you have to actually be able to share the cookie information between the nodes in the cluster. So, but today's video is all about how to actually get started with cookies and how to make your application actually function first, and then we'll dive into the topic of what needs to be done. So what I have here is our sample application. This is going to be our starting point. And basically what this is me hosting this application inside of my local Service Fabric cluster, which is a single node cluster on this development machine. And this is a starting template with some slight modifications that I've done in prior videos where I explained the concept of an application gateway and us being able to access it here. Now, what we have here is our home page, the context page, and about page. And what we're going to do is we're going to add another button here for being able to see protected content that's going to be protected by our authorization attribute. And then as well, we're going to add a logout button so we can actually clear the session cookie and let the user restart the login process when they wanted to. So let's go ahead and dive into the code, and I'll show you what needs to be done. So the first thing that I want to show you is we're going to go into our layout page, and we're going to go ahead and add those menu items first. So I'll just scroll down to this area here where we have defined our buttons, and I'll just copy this menu option here, and I'll add the logout option at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and specify the ASP controller to be a profile controller, which is something we're going to create. We're going to take the user to the index page. And then for the logout action, we're going to create an account controller, and we're going to take the user to the logout page. And then let's rename these to make sure that they show correctly for the end users. And basically, this will end up allowing us to see the menu items. So we're going to have the profile button and the logout button. So the next step is for us to actually go ahead and do a couple of things. One is we're going to need to collect the user information, so specifically the username and password from our end users. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a model called login model. So I'll create a folder called models, and I'll go ahead and create a class. We're just going to call login model. And it's going to be pretty straightforward. So basically, we're going to create two properties, a string of username, and the other one is going to be password. Okay, so the next step is we're going to want to add a controller in the respective views for those controllers. So the first controller we're going to create is going to be our account controller. So let's go ahead and do that. And it's going to be an empty controller. We don't actually need anything in that controller. And then another controller we're going to create is going to be the profile controller. Okay, now in our profile controller, I'm going to show you the behavior initially, and then we'll add the authorized attribute, and you'll see the behavior of that. So what we're going to start off, however, is in our account controller, we're going to rename this action here to login, and this is going to be an HTTP GET. And then we're going to also have another login action that's going to be a post, and that's also going to be called login. Now the difference being is that it is a post and is going to be accepting some values from our user interface. So we're going to actually accept a login model, and let's go ahead and add the using statement. and we'll just call it model. And then we're going to have a logout model, and that's also going to be a get. And we're also going to add another action, not model. It's going to be unauthorized. And this is going to be something that you can actually build in case a user is trying to authenticate, but they're actually not authorized. So they're going to be taken to this page if you decide to actually build it. So in this case, it's going to be an HTTP GET as well. And I'll just leave it like this. So the next step is for us to actually start building logic for what we want to see the login to actually perform. So what I have here is some code that I can just quickly paste in here. And what we're going to start off with is our login action. So in the login action, we're going to basically validate the username and password that is going to be passed in by the user. So what we have here is our model real quick. So let me rename some of these variables as I've changed them since I did the initial setup. And then basically what we're doing is here we're going to be calling a method called login user. Now this method can actually reach out to your database backend, another external system to obtain the token to validate the username and password. But for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to allow any username password combination for the user to be able to log in. So what we're going to do is just always return true in this case. So this actually now is going to be checking to see if the user is allowed to log in. Then we're going to create a claim object, and let's go ahead and import the namespace itself where that's hosted. And then so what it's going to do is actually going to create a claim with a claim type of name, and we're going to pass in the username. Then we're going to create a claims identity with the parameter of, see, this is an authentication type. So type of an authentication we're going to be using is going to be login. Then we're going to create a claims principal, and we're going to pass in that user identity. And then the next step is going to be to actually call the sign-in method on our context and give it the authentication scheme. Now, this is something that actually has to match another configuration that I'm going to show you how to do, which actually enables the cookie authentication process itself, or the specific middleware for cookie authentication. And then the other parameter that we pass in is the principal parameter. So now the reason why we see this squiggly line here is because we actually need to adjust our action result to actually be of an async type and return a task object. So let's do that real quick. And this facilitates the async process to actually provide better response times within your application. So now what we have is a fully functioning login method, as long as all of the other components are actually implemented correctly. So the next step that we're going to want to do is actually implement a logout method as well. And it's pretty simple. All we actually have to do is just invoke the process of signing out and pass the authentication scheme that we want to leverage here. And then we're going to redirect the user to the home page itself. So just like above, we also have to add the async. And now this process is set up, and we should be able to actually start using this particular controller. Now, the next step, actually, what we need to do is we need to actually create a view for this as well. So let's go ahead and actually set up the folders for these views, and one is going to be called account, and another folder we're going to create here is for the profile. So let's go ahead and create the actual views that we're going to be using. So in this case, I'm going to create an empty view, and the first view is going to be called login. And another view that we're going to create is going to be called unauthorized. Okay, and then for our profile controller, we're going to create an index view. And that index view is going to just display some user information just so we can actually see that the user properly logged in and that actual resources that we're trying to see are actually there. So I'll get back to the profile view in a moment. But for the time being, what I want to do is actually, let me go ahead and close out the HTML files, and I'll go ahead and rebuild this just so we can get IntelliSense working. Okay, so let's go to the unauthorized view first. And this is a very basic modification I'm doing here. All I'm going to be letting the user know is that you're not authorized to view the content, so please log in. And then I'll go ahead and save that. And we'll go to our login page here. And I'm going to paste in the HTML content for this page, or for this particular view. So let me explain this view real quick so you have a basic understanding. So the first thing we're doing is we're actually defining within this login view itself the model type, .NET type that we're going to be using, and this particular view is representing. So in this case, it's the login model object, which is going to allow us to actually leverage the username and password and be able to pass in those values into the actual data model or inside of a controller itself. So you can see that the properties we're going to actually be populating are going to be username and password. We begin our form, and this is actually going to create the HTML elements for the form submission. We're going to actually invoke the login action on our account controller. It's going to be of type post. And then we're adding a CSS class for form sign-in. Now, I've actually gone ahead in a prior steps. I've actually set up the specific CSS styling. This could be different depending on the type of template you're using, the type of application you're building. So basically, you can find many examples of Bootstrap-based login forms and just make one yourself and reference all of the respective elements. I just went on Google and searched for Bootstrap login page, and I found this example and just copy and paste it in here. So then the next step is we're creating a small header to ask the user to please log in. We're going to prompt him for the username and password. We're going to do a small separation between the two fields, and then we're going to put the actual login button itself. And then at the bottom, if we ever need to display to the user that something failed, we'll be able to actually render that content from our controller action into the view if we needed to. So that's pretty much it for our login view itself, and we should be able to actually run this and see the application itself and go from there. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this particular page, and once it starts up, we should be able to see the updated menu, and we should be able to also navigate to the different pages. So in here, we still have the home page. We now have the profile and contact, about, and logout. So if I click on profile, you'll see all it just says is index because we haven't actually put any content there. The about, and then logout. Now logout doesn't actually do anything, and the reason for that is because it's actually trying to clear out the actual session information, and we don't have the cookies actually enabled just yet. So we can ignore this error for now. Now I'll go ahead and stop this application, and actually let's go to our profile page real quick, and we can add some content here. And basically what this is going to have is we're going to be pulling our user information from the view data that is being populated in the controller action, and then we're going to actually display that information. So let's make sure that our profile controller is actually passing that information back. And all we have to do in this particular case is we're just going to get the actual user identity name, and then we're going to retrieve the actual claim name as well. So let's import the namespace from security for the claim types. And then what I'm going to also do is I'm going to use this question mark symbol here to indicate that in case this object doesn't exist, it doesn't try to execute the next set of getters on the properties, because they will not exist, since this is just to prevent null reference exception. And the reason I'm doing this is because actually for the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to spend too much time actually trying to add logic that doesn't focus on a specific topic. So this is just to make it quick and easy for us to go through the demo. So in this particular case now, if actually I run the application, you'll see that the actual user and the claim information is actually going to be blank, because the user is actually not signing in. So, but I wanted to do a complete demo to make sure that you actually saw what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page real quick, and then we should be able to actually click on the profile button and see that we'll see the updated HTML, but there's actually not going to be any content here. So if I click here, you can see the current user is blank and current claim is blank as well. So let's go back to our code. And now the next step is for us to actually enable the cookie middleware. And the first thing we actually want to do is we want to add a reference to a NuGet package. And so we're going to right click on dependencies and go to manage packages. And I'm going to go ahead and search for this cookie NuGet package called Microsoft ASP.NET Authentication Cookies. And since I'm using a version of 1.1 of .NET Core, I'm going to go ahead and select a lower version, which is 1.1.3 for this NuGet package. And I'll go ahead and click install and go ahead and add it to my project. Okay, so everything got installed, and the next step is for me to actually add this into our configuration of our application. So we'll go ahead to the and go to the startup.cs file, and in this CS file is where we're going to actually tell the application that we need to start using the cookie authentication mechanism. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create a cookie auth options, and we're going to leverage the cookie authentication options object. The first value we're going to actually set is this authentication scheme. Now, this authentication scheme is what I was mentioning before. Inside of our account controller, we actually are referencing this cookie authentication. So that's what we're going to actually be leveraging here. This is how it knows which settings to actually leverage. And so when you invoke the login or sign in async and sign out async method, this is how it knows to tie that together. So you can actually have a different authentication scheme and options defined for your application, and actually be able to leverage them within your application for different authentication processes. So, but in this case, I'm doing a very simple demo, so I'm only using one of them. So then the next step we're going to implement is the actual login path. So the login path, and then the access deny path. So let's put these two here. And basically what we're specifying here is this path string object. And what I'm doing here is I'm also concatenating the base path. Now, if you remember in our prior videos that we actually needed to obtain this base path. And the reason for that is because we're hosting an application inside of our service fabric cluster, and then we're accessing it through the application gateway. That's why we needed to add this additional information here to know which particular path we're going to actually be redirecting the user to. So all I'm doing here is I'm taking that base path that we retrieved above. We're going to actually add the account/login, and then for the access denied, we're doing the same thing. It's just it's going to be taking you to the unauthorized action within that account controller. Then the next step we're going to specify, or the setting we're going to specify, is automatic authenticate. So basically we're telling the application that we want to basically handle the automatic challenging of credentials. So we're going to set that to true. And then the other item, last item, is automatic challenge. So this automatic challenge is going to force the actual application to redirect the user to the login process in the page that's actually defined up above. So once we actually set this up, this would allow us to actually start challenging the user for credentials. Now, if you remember right before I added this code, I tried to actually click on a profile controller or the button in the menu, and it actually showed us nothing. So, and that's because we actually don't have anything defined from an authorization perspective to tell the application that we actually want to enforce the authorization. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and specify authorize attribute. And this is actually going to tell the MVC Core application to start enforcing the authorization process. And because we have cookies enabled now, at least we have the options defined. I forgot to add the use cookies method. Only if I could actually type correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this variable. And so now we've actually configured our application. So let's go ahead and run this and see the end result of this. So what we should see is now when I click the profile button, I should be actually be taken to the login page. And then if I actually click on the logout button, it's actually going to clear that login cookie information and then ask the user to log in once again. Okay, so the application started. Now if I click on profile, you'll see that we're taken to the login page. If I click logout, before we actually had an error, but now since there is the login process is actually enabled and the cookies are actually enabled, then the logout process is working. So in this case, all it's doing is just taking you to the home page again. So let's go ahead and click on profile and see how this works. So if I put in username dev, put in whatever we want for the password, click login, and now you can actually see that the current user is set to dev and the current claim is set to dev as well. Now if I go ahead and start navigating the application, you'll see that everything's working, including when I click the profile, the user is not being asked to log in anymore because he's actually signed in and we're tracking the cookie. If I was to actually go ahead and close the browser and reopen the browser again and go to the page once more, if I click profile, we actually are taken to this page and the user is still logged in. The reason why this is happening again is because the cookie is already there and you can see it right here. So we know about the user and everything is good to go. So if I actually go ahead and click logout, we'll actually see that when I go to profile, that the user is actually being asked to log in again. So let's do that real quick. So you can see that this is the actual cookie. So .aspnetcore.cookie authentication. And then when I click logout, that cookie is gone. So for the purposes of this demo, I actually wanted to show you that you're able to actually get the cookies set up and then start leveraging the cookie authentication mechanism for this. Now, the other thing that I actually want to show you in a later video, which actually starts dealing with the distributed session cookies, is that once you actually get this deployed to your Service Fabric cluster, this is where you're going to need to make some adjustments in Service Fabric. It's not itself, but in the application that's hosted in Service Fabric. And we're going to be actually implementing a new service that's going to allow us to actually persist the information across the nodes in the cluster. So I'll show you real quick what I mean. So if I actually go ahead and deploy this application to our remote node, to our remote Service Fabric cluster, I'll go ahead and publish this right now. Let me actually navigate to that cluster. I wanted to go to the Explorer just to show you. So this is deploying our application. And then right now I have it set to only deploy to 2 nodes, but I'm going to go ahead and actually scale this out to 5 nodes. And then you'll see it actually will begin the deployment on all 5 nodes. And let me open up the actual page itself, and so it actually starts compiling it. And then I'll show you the specific example that I want to walk you through in the next video. So as you can see here, when I actually try to refresh, I'm still bouncing between the different nodes in a cluster, and it's actually going to compile the application on each node first time we actually access the page. But then when I try to actually log in, you'll notice that the user is going to be prompted for credentials on some refreshes, and on some refreshes it's actually not going to ask the user, and it's going to just automatically sign them in. So all I'm doing right now is just forcing the each server in the node, each node in a cluster, to actually refresh the application and make sure it's actually fully compiled. So it looks like all of them should be good to go at this point. So now when I click profile, again, we're taken to the login page. And then if I click the profile once more, it keeps taking me there. So let's log in. And then you can see that even after I press login, it actually still presented the login page. Now pay attention to this bottom screen here. If I actually try to log in once again, and then I'll hit the profile tab, you'll notice that periodically I'll actually get to a page that actually shows me the information that is correct. And the reason for that is because some of the nodes in the cluster are actually caching the data from a cookie perspective, and they're able to actually decrypt the cookie and everything is working fine. But each node in the cluster actually has their unique encryption key that is being used, and that is something that we're going to actually be implementing as a mechanism or a service in the next video of how to actually share these keys between all of the nodes in a cluster, and I'll walk you through the actual code for that. So if you have any questions about this particular cookie topic, and you're trying to set it up or you're running into issues, feel free to put your comments in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. And then in the future video, I'll walk you through the next phase of being able to build a distributed and stateful service that will allow us to actually share the session keys in our application. And then later, we're going to actually take it a step further, where we're going to actually be allowing the user to store user-based information in a different type of a service called a reliable actor service. And that service is actually going to persist information about the user themselves in a different manner than a normal stateful service would. So hopefully you enjoyed this content, and I will be talking to you in the next video.